If you want to get closer to the action, this is certainly one way to do it. I'm going to talk about a few alternatives on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there everybody, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions. If you've got photo questions, you know what to do by now. You just go to askdavidbergman.com, submit your questions right there on the site. I just might pick it to answer here on a future show. Also, if you're not already a subscriber to the Adorama YouTube channel, why the heck not? Go ahead and click that button down below. Use the little bell icon, you'll be notified as soon as new photo shows come out all week long for myself and the other photo hosts right here on Adorama TV. You might be wondering why I'm out here at a baseball game. It's because Michel V sent in a question and it goes like this. Do teleconverters degrade your image? The only other way of getting longer reach would be to crop in post, but you can only crop so much before your image starts to suffer. So which method is best? This is assuming that using a longer lens or getting closer to the subject is not an option. Thank you. Michelle, thanks so much for sending in that question. I really appreciate it. I am out here at the ballpark. This is the Long Island Ducks. I'm out in Long Island, New York, and we're at Fairfield Properties Ballpark. I want to send a huge thank you to the Ducks organization. They were super accommodating to allow me to come out here to photograph this video and shoot some pictures so I can demonstrate this for you guys. So if you're in the Long Island, New York area, come on out. It's a fantastic time. There's a million kids out here. Bring the family, and thanks to the Ducks again. But if you're shooting sports action, I shot a lot of sports action over the years. I used to work for Sports Illustrated, done Olympics, the Super Bowls, and World Series. And the key to making great action photos is really to fill the frame. You want to get your action as tight as possible. When you can see the pitcher's face or the batter's face, the running back, you know, you really can get in tight. It's going to make for just a more dynamic picture. That background's going to go more out of focus. It's really going to look great. And not just for sports, even if you shoot wildlife, like birds and things like that, you really want to get in as tight as you can. Yes, there are options to make beautiful tableau wide photos, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about sports action, and generally you want to get in as tight as you can. Now, the way to do that, it's great if you can get in physically closer. That's not always possible. I'm out here at the ballpark, right? Normally I would shoot baseball down in one of the photo wells. I'm up here in one of the suites because it's a little away from, I don't have to watch for foul balls coming at my head. So I'm a little away from the crowd. So, but normally you'd be down in the photo well, but you could still only get so close. At a football game or a soccer game, you're going to be on the sideline. You're not going to be right out there. So it's not always possible to get physically closer. So to get those full, fill the frame images, there are really three options. And I'm going to tell you what they all are. Each one has pros and cons. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to shoot some pictures, go through the options, and I'm going to bring them back in the studio and we'll look at them and I'll sort of analyze what works and what doesn't and what some of the best options are. So the three methods really are, one, use what you have and then just crop it in post, right? So if you have whatever lens you have, the longest lens you have, just shoot with that. It's going to be maybe too wide, but then crop it in post. In the computer afterward, crop it up and see how that looks. Yes, you're going to lose some megapixels depending on which lens you're using, but we'll try some options and see how that looks. The second way to do it is to use one of these. This is what Michelle asked about. This is a teleconverter. This is the Canon TC, what is this? The EF2X3, right? So this is a 2X teleconverter. There are generally two sizes of teleconverter, two lengths, a 1.4 and a 2X. The 2X doubles your effective focal length. The 1.4 extends it by 1.4 times, right? So, so this is definitely going to give you longer reach, but you give up something with this. By using a 2X, you lose 2 stops of light. You lose 2 aperture stops, right? And I'm going to demonstrate that in a minute. The 1.4, you lose 1 stop. So that's the biggest difference. We'll talk about quality. Quality for these things really depends on how well it's made. I mean, the newest Canon teleconverters are very, very good. 10, 20 years ago, teleconverters were not something I would use. Today, I might consider it more than I have in the past because you're adding optical elements, right? So anytime you add something between the camera and the lens, you're going to lose some quality. How much quality you're going to lose depends on how well that teleconverter is made, right? So this is definitely another way to go when you don't want to go to option 3. And option 3 is simply to buy a longer lens or rent a longer lens. If you have a one-off shoot or a week's worth of games to shoot, you can rent lenses from Adorama Rentals and places like that where you can just use those lenses that might be out of your budget, but you can definitely rent those. Now, if you are a professional sports photographer and you do this all the time, you're going to probably invest in some of those long lenses. So let's go through some of those options. I'll show you in the real world sort of how they look and how it works. So I'm at the the ballpark, I'm going to shoot all three of those options from the same distance, right? So I'm going to photograph the pitcher, who's right down there. I'd say we're probably 200, maybe 200 yards away from the pitcher. It's a pretty good distance. And I'm going to photograph all of them with the same, right at the same area, right at the pitcher. And then we're going to, like I said, bring those images back in the studio, and I'm going to compare them. I'll mention my settings as I go, but then again in the studio we can really get more detailed. So the first option, like I said, is to use what you have. Now, you might have a lens like this. This is the 70-200 2.8. This is, by the way, is the Canon R3 body. I love this thing. This is the state of the art. And the 70-200 2.8 allows you to shoot a 2.8 aperture all the way through the focal length range from 70 to 200. A lot of people have this lens. And by the way, I also have a RF to EF converter on here. I'm using an R series lens with an EF lens. An R series body with an EF lens. And I'm doing that all day, so I'm going to keep that RF converter on here. You don't lose any quality with these converters, by the way. The Canon EF to RF converter, zero quality loss. You can use all your old EF lenses, which I love. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shoot a couple pictures here of the pitcher, and let's see how that looks, right? So let's figure out my exposure. First of all, let me just take a look. And I would say I'm probably at about 500 at 4 at 2000 ISO. 500 at 4, 500 shutter speed, f4 at 2000. And actually this is a 2.8 lens, of course, so I can go down to 2.8 and shoot at 1000 ISO. So that's going to really give me a lot more quality with the lower ISO. So let's shoot a couple frames at 200 millimeters. That's as tight as I can get with this lens without a teleconverter. So let's do a couple frames here. All right, now you can hear, I'm using the electronic shutter, 30 frames a second. Why not? You know, I might as well get that whole sequence, and then I can choose later. Now, you can see how that looks. It's a wide shot. I'm going to, again, crop it in the studio and see how it looks, because I am at 2.8 at a low ISO, so it might look pretty good. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the 2x teleconverter. So let's put this down here. Need to organize my lenses a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and slip this on right on the body. So now I've got the 2x, and the 70-200 goes right on the end of there. And so now what I've done is I've effectively turned this 70-200 into a 140, because 70 times 2, to 400 millimeters. The 200 millimeters becomes a 400 millimeter field of view. Now again, I told you, you lose 2 stops of aperture. So that's now, instead of a 2.8, I can only shoot at 5.6. So I lose 2 stops, so at 5.6 I was at 1000 ISO. Now I'm gonna be at 4000 ISO, okay? So 500 at 5.6 at 4000. As soon as they picture, I'm gonna shoot a couple more frames. All right, and you can see that's much closer, right? So, because I've doubled the effective focal length. And again, we'll see in the studio how the quality is with that teleconverter. Now, the next step up from this might be another lens you may or may not have. This is the 100 to 400. This lens is a 4.5 at 100, and it's 5.6 at 400. So you could use this lens with the teleconverter and really get some decent images. But let's start without the converter. And I'm just gonna put that lens on by itself. And at 400 millimeters, this is a 5.6, so it's really the same thing that I was just shooting. Remember, I was just shooting the 70-200 at 2.8 with the teleconverter, became a 5.6. So now I'm going to do it with the 100-400 at 5.6 without any teleconverter. Let's see how that looks compared to the last one. All right, so we had the change of the inning, so it's a different picture, but you can see that it's the same focal length that I was shooting before, same aperture, same ISO, everything's exactly the same as the 70-200 with the 2.8 and the teleconverter. So if you don't have this lens, you can replicate it with that other lens and the converter. Now, let's try to step up from here. If we put the teleconverter on this 100-400, what's gonna happen? So let me grab it off of the other lens. And here's the thing, this lens now is going to become a monster focal length, right? This now becomes a 200 to 800 millimeter lens, effectively. The field of view becomes 200 to 800. The problem is I lose a lot of aperture. I was already at 5.6, so now I'm going to be at 200 millimeters, I'm at f9, and at 800 millimeters, I'm at f11. So if I go to 11 here, then I'm going to lose another couple of stops. So I was at 4,000. I'm gonna go to 16,000 on this. Actually, let's go to, yeah, 16,000. The beauty of the R3 is it can handle that. It's gonna be a little noisy, but the R3, I would not hesitate. If I had no option and I really needed 800 millimeters, and this is the way I wanted to do it, I would absolutely not hesitate. So let's see how tight this is and how that looks. Wow, you can see how tight that is, right? 800 millimeters, it's not even full body. That's a tight action photo. And if I was on the ground and really zoomed in tight on his face, that would be really, really nice. So again, I'll compare in the studio and see how that looks. Now, just a couple more options, by the way. Let me show you a couple things. I've got over here, this is, Canon makes this 200 to 400 millimeter. It's an f4 lens, so it's f4 all the way through. It's a lot bigger than the 100 to 400 because it is an f4 all the way through. But the beauty of this lens is it has on it a built-in teleconverter. So it's got a 1.4 built in. That's 1.0 and that's 1.4. And you lose the one stop of light, it becomes a 5.6, and it effectively becomes a, when that teleconverter is engaged, it becomes a 280 to 560 at 5.6. So this is a really nice option. It's a very expensive lens. Like I said, if you're not a professional sports shooter or a professional wildlife shooter and making money with your photography, you're probably not doing something like this. But that is definitely a great option to use. Now there is one more option, just for fun. I talked about using longer lenses. Well, why not go all the way? This is the 600 millimeter f4. This lens is $13,000 or something like that. So not for the faint of heart, not for everybody. I have to use a monopod with this and with the 200 to 400. It's too heavy to handhold for any extended period of time. So you definitely want to use a monopod. Let's see how this looks compared to some of the other things we've done, just to see if it's worth the money, right? So I'm going to take this off of here and take off my cap. And so now, because I'm at f4, I can bring my aperture, I can bring my ISO down. Let's see, I was at 11, so 1 stop, 2 stops, 3 stops down from 16,000. So that's 8,000, 4,000. I'm all the way back to 2,000 now at 500th of a second at f4. Obviously, I might want to push my shutter speed up if I was really shooting action here, but and then bump the ISO a little bit more. But just for demonstration purposes, I want to keep it all the same. So I'm at 2,000 ISO, 500 f4. Let's see how this looks. All right, so you can see how that looks, right? And that's, I'm at a low ISO, it's beautiful. This lens, I mean, you just can't beat it, right? If you're a professional shooter, you know, shooting sports, this is what, you know, this is the gold standard, this is the top of the line. It doesn't really get any better, and it's really fun to shoot. Now, just for fun, because we can, let's put the teleconverter on here, right? The 2X, I don't have a 1.4 with me, but let's put the 2X on here. It's a little hard to manage here by myself, so let's do that. And we're going to put that on there. 2X. Now, what is this lens? It barely fits in the frame, right? It's now a 1200 millimeter lens. It's f8, but still f8. We shot at f11 before, so this is f8, 1200 millimeters. So we got to bring down our ISO from 2,000 to 8,000, and we're at f8. Let's see how tight this is. Wow, so you can see how tight I am. That is full frame, uncropped, 1200 millimeters from, you know, about 200 feet away. Pretty impressive. Only an 8,000 ISO, which again, looks really great on this camera. So we're gonna switch over to the studio. I'm gonna take a look. Gonna get out of this noisy ballpark and we'll see how those images look. Thanks everybody. All right, I'm back here in the studio in New York City where it's quiet and dry, so it's a little bit more comfortable. Thanks again to the Long Island Ducks for having me out. It was a super fun day at the park, despite the weather. I had a great time out there, so thanks for allowing me to come out there and film this. Now, let's talk about the images and the pros and cons of each way that I did that. The first one, cropping in post, right? The 7200, the lens that I had with me, that sort of, you know, good general purpose lens. That lens, the 7200 2.8, is really sharp. It's a beautiful lens. The images look great. So then when I crop it in post, I'm really not going to lose much as far as quality, because if you start with a really great image, you're not going to lose much when you start to go ahead and crop. Of course, there's no cost to doing that. I mean, you're just doing it in the computer, assuming you already have software to do that. but you don't have to buy any extra gear. So there's definitely an advantage there. I didn't talk about crop sensor cameras. That is also a way to go because that will it will narrow your field of view, giving you essentially a longer lens, and you don't really lose any pixels because those cameras are made already with a lot of pixels. Now they're smaller pixels, and the image quality, you could argue, on a crop sensor camera isn't quite as good as a full frame camera. It doesn't look as good at higher ISOs. If you're talking apples to apples, there are a lot of other factors that can affect that, so it really depends on which camera. But that could be a way to go if you regularly shoot sports and don't have, or something where you need a longer lens and don't own longer lenses. Shooting with a crop sensor body might be a good way to go. Working again on full frame and you're going to crop, or even cropping on a crop sensor body, cropping and more, the downside of that is you're just going to lose pixels, right? Because you're cropping away, you're throwing away some of those pixels. You could have some image quality issues there when it may start to pixelate if you go too small. But generally, if it's going to be running, small on social media, it's not going to be that much of a problem, especially if you start with a camera that has a lot of megapixels. Something like the Canon R5 is 45 megapixels to start with. When you start to crop that away, you're still going to have plenty of pixels to go left in your image. So if you have a camera like that, you're certainly going to be better off. Now, method 2, using a teleconverter. The advantages to that, it does extend your field of view, either 1.4 or 2x in most cases, which is really nice, and it's relatively inexpensive, usually about a few $100s for a good one. They're lightweight, they're easy to just throw in your bag, and you'll have it whenever you need it. If you don't need it all the time, that's great, and then when you need it, you can just grab it out and stick it on there, and it's a great way to extend your field of view. So definitely some advantage. The disadvantages are, as we discussed, you lose some light, right? You give up some aperture. One stop with a 1.4, two stops with a 2x, but newer cameras really look good at high ISOs. So don't be afraid necessarily to push those ISOs up. You saw that I shot at 16,000 at one point, and it looked pretty darn good. Now, there are more optical elements when you put on a TC. You're adding more optics to the front of your lens. So anytime you add more elements to, that lens is made as a single object, and those lens elements all work together. When you add something in front or behind that, there is potential to decrease some sharpness. You can add some aberration, especially as your aperture starts to get really small. And again, that gets better with each generation of teleconverter, but there is potential for that to happen, especially if you're using one that's not quite as good, maybe less expensive. Something like the 1.4x that's built in to that 200 to 400 looks amazing because it's made for that lens, it's matched to that lens, and looks great. But when you start using an external one and you put it on, let's say the 100-400, and I put it on there, I was at f11 at 800 millimeters, and at f11, your autofocus starts to slow down. It's not going to work quite as fast. The Canons actually do a really good job with it, where the teleconverter still works. The autofocus still works at f11. Not all cameras do, so you've got to check and make sure your camera at that aperture will work when you put that teleconverter on. There's also physical things you have to check and make sure that this certain teleconverter works with that certain lens. It may or may not. In most cases it will, but you just got to make sure before you purchase something like that. And then the third option, just using longer lenses, shooting full frame, not cropping. Obviously the advantage of that, best image quality. I mean, these lenses are just made so well, premium craftsmanship. If you're going to spend that kind of money, better be made well, sharp as a tack. Absolutely a beautiful way to go if you can afford it. That's the downside. Super expensive, right? If money's no object, it's absolutely a great way to go, but they're super expensive. They're also really big and really heavy. That 600 f4, you really can't shoot for any extended period of time without a tripod or a monopod. So that is the downside of those. Not something you're just going to throw in your bag and bring with you on vacation, right? So to sum up, I think it really depends on what type of photographer you are and who you're shooting for and if it's a career or if it's a hobby, right? If you're just a hobbyist and you're bringing your camera on vacation or just photographing your kids out at the park, you're probably, you can either get closer, right? That would be my first choice. If you need more reach, try to move closer to your subject instead of just sitting 8 miles away. Go ahead and zoom with your feet and get in there. And occasionally when you need some more reach, just crop and post. Like I said, if it's going to be small on social media, 3 inches on Instagram, nobody's going to notice, nobody's going to mind that it's really, you gave up a lot of pixels to crop that in most cases. If you're an enthusiast, an advanced enthusiast, or maybe a prosumer, and you regularly need longer reach, but maybe you're not getting paid enough to afford those big lenses, a teleconverter is the way to go. Definitely a good option there. Throw it in your bag. You have it with you. You can throw it on your lens. if you can't get closer, if you're shooting pro sports or amateur sports and you really can't go out on the field or do something like that, or wildlife, and you really need that reach, having a teleconverter, either a 1.4 and a 2X, if you can have both, bring both, right? And definitely a great way to go. Get good ones, spend the money on good quality ones that will, are not going to affect your autofocus, and the image quality is still going to be really, really good. And then, of course, if you're a professional, you've just got to have the long glass. You just do. You're competing against other photographers. You've got to have the best image quality. Your clients are going to notice. It's really going to make your images stick out a little bit more than what everybody else is doing, and you just need to have it to compete. So I know it's a lot of money. You got to spend it to make it sometimes, but that's what most pro photographers are going to use. So that's my advice. Thanks, Michel, for sending in that question about teleconverters. I really appreciate it. Remember, if you've got your own photo question, just go to askdavidbergman.com. Submit your question right there on the site. I just might pick it to answer here on a future show. If you're not already a subscriber to the Adorama YouTube channel, go ahead and click that button down below. Use the little bell icon. You'll be notified as soon as new photo shows come out for myself and all the other photo hosts right here on Adorama TV. I appreciate you guys being here. Keep those questions coming. I'll be back here next time with a brand new question right here on, you guessed it, Ask David Bergman.